Keanu Reeves stands at the podium, a faint tremor shaking his hand as he grips it tight, unshakable calm warring with a torrent of pressure that threatens to drown him, the air crackling with raw, unspoken anguish. In a grand hall teeming with a sea of faces, each one ravenous for truth, clawing for accountability, every eye and camera bores into him like 1,000 silent screams, awaiting words that could shatter the suffocating silence or mend a trust fractured beyond repair. A liberal reporter's relentless questions loom like a storm on the horizon, ready to tear through his resolve. What would you do if your world crumbled in an instant, if every hope you held bled out before your eyes? Where are you watching from, safe in the shadows, or trembling on the edge with him? For more stories that seize your soul and set your spirit ablaze, subscribe to the Motivation for Success channel now. The autumn afternoon in Centerville draped the city in a brittle, golden shroud, its streets pulsing with the fevered hum of a world teetering on the brink of collapse. Inside the press room, a vast, gleaming mausoleum of glass and steel, the air quivered with a tension so visceral it felt like a heartbeat trapped in a cage of silence. Sunlight slashed through towering windows, painting the floor in jagged streaks of gold, while the acrid sting of coffee coiled through the room, weaving with the polished musk of wood and the frantic, papery rasp of anticipation, a sensory requiem for a day destined to bleed. This was no mere gathering of minds, it was a coliseum, a brutal clash of hope and despair, where one man's spirit would be torn apart beneath the relentless glare of a nation's hunger. Keanu Reeves stood at the epicenter, a figure sculpted from stillness yet trembling with the ghosts of unseen wars. Known for his quiet grace and eyes that cradled a universe of buried pain, he had transcended the flicker of celluloid to become a reluctant savior, an icon whose name whispered through the cracks of a society desperate for truth amid a flood of deceit. Today, he bore that mantle like a shroud soaked in blood, rooted behind a podium that shimmered under the harsh lights, its sleek surface a cruel mockery of his fragility. His dark gaze swept the expanse before him, drinking in the sea of faces, journalists crouched like predators, cameras glaring like cold, unyielding deities, every soul tethered to the raw pulse of this moment. He felt it, the unbearable weight like a boulder crushing his ribs, a silent oath that this was no stage but a slaughterhouse where truth would be both weapon and wound. The press conference unfurled with a rhythm both deliberate and doomed, a tightrope fraying under the strain of 1,000 unspoken cries. Reporters from every forsaken corner of the land had descended, their questions sharpened by months of chaos, policies meant to mend a nation splintering into shards of rage and ruin. Keanu's voice pierced the stillness first, steady as a blade through bone, each word a desperate thread stitching a wound too vast to heal. He spoke of unity, of reforms clawing their way from the ashes of betrayal, of a dream where the broken might stand unbroken. His tone was a fragile calm, a lighthouse devoured by storm, yet beneath it roared a maelstrom, grief, guilt, and a resolve forged in fire. The room clung to him, the clatter of keyboards and the scrape of pens a faint dirge beneath his trembling cadence, every listener a witness to a man teetering on the edge of collapse. Then came the cataclysm. A voice raw, feral, a scream of sound ripped through the silence like a gunshot shattering a dawn sky. Jordan Blake, a reporter whose name was carved in the stone of defiance, surged forward from the front row, her presence a lightning bolt splitting the dry husk of the room. Her eyes blazed with a fury born of shattered faith, her notepad gripped like a shield, her pen slashing the air in a frenzied dance of desperation. "Keanu," she spat, her voice a lash of venom and heartbreak, "do you really think these pathetic reforms can save a nation choking on its own blood?" The question exploded, a brutal, unyielding force, its echoes clawing at the stillness. It was no gentle inquiry, it was a death knell, a demand for the soul behind the facade, a plea from a woman who'd seen too much to swallow platitudes. Time fractured, the room collapsing into a single, suffocating void. The murmur of voices, the rustle of paper, the distant wail of the city beyond the glass all fused into a deafening abyss. Keanu's gaze locked with hers, unyielding as a mountain against a gale, yet within it flickered a wound too deep to name a recognition that this was no debate but a cry for redemption. "Jordan," he rasped, his voice a frayed rope of resolve and ruin, "I've carried a vision of a world where no one's left to drown, where every voice cuts through the dark. These reforms aren't salvation, they're a heartbeat, a fight to keep us breathing." His words were a desperate prayer, each one a splinter of glass torn from his throat, knowing they might shred him before they reached her. But Jordan was a storm unbowed. She lunged forward, her eyes glinting with tears she refused to release, her voice cracking through the weight of her anguish. "Then why, when we're screaming for flesh and bone, do you choke us with ash? Is the truth too rotten for your saintly tongue?" Her words were a sob cloaked in rage, a plea for something real in a world of hollow husks, her desperation a mirror to a nation clawing at its own grave. A collective gasp tore through the room, pens slashing like daggers, the air thick with her torment. The light seared Keanu's face, illuminating the fractures in his calm, a twitch of his mouth, a shadow of agony in his stare. He drew a ragged breath, a pause that clawed at the room's edges, the sound of his inhale a thunderclap in the silence. "I've bled the truth before," he said, his tone a jagged blade of steel and sorrow, "and I'll bleed it again. But this isn't your gallows, it's our last stand." The silence that followed was a gaping wound, swallowing every sound but the frantic thud of hearts. Reporters froze, some trembling with reverence, others snarling at the scent of cowardice. It was the hush before obliteration, every breath a countdown to chaos. Then Jordan roared again, her voice a tidal wave of grief and wrath. "Is it honor or fear that keeps you dodging, Keanu? Are you shielding us or yourself from a truth that might bury us all?" Her words were a sledgehammer, shattering the room's fragile shell, and for a heartbeat, the very air wept, caught between worship and damnation. Keanu's eyes erupted a molten blaze of pain and defiance. He stood rooted, letting her accusation carve into his marrow, his gaze drifting to the windows where the city's distant pulse mocked the inferno within. "I'm not here to hide," he growled, his voice a low thunder trembling with unshed tears. "I'm here to drag us from the abyss together. My answers are my scars, etched for every soul still clinging to life." The rawness in his tone was a knife turned inward, slashing through the room, piercing those who dared to feel the weight of his breaking. His hands gripped the podium, knuckles white, as if anchoring himself against the flood threatening to sweep him away. What erupted was no mere clash, it was a massacre of ideals laid bare. Other voices surged, a cacophony of doubt and despair. Alex Monroe, a grizzled reporter from the shadows, thrust a hand up, his face a mask of quiet fury. "Mr. Reeves, isn't ducking these truths a betrayal of the people you swore to raise?" His words, calm yet venomous, landed like a grenade, splintering the crowd into shards of belief and scorn. The room split wide, some saw his restraint as a martyr's grace, others as a traitor's veil. The air thundered with the crash of chairs, the whine of machinery, every sound a scream in the rising tide. It was as if the walls buckled, bearing witness to a moment where hope dangled by a thread over a chasm of rage. "I carry your screams in my chest," Keanu choked out, his voice a broken ember flickering in the dark. "I've given my life to this truth, justice, every damn piece of me. But change is a monster, it devours easy lies." His response was a prayer through gritted teeth, a confession that leadership was a crown of thorns pressed into his skull. Yet Jordan was a tempest unbroken. "Then why smother us in fog when we're starving for fire? Isn't it your burden to bleed honesty till we're all drenched?" Her plea was a wail, a mirror to a nation drowning in its own shadows, her voice cracking with the weight of 1,000 unheard cries. The room imploded, every sound a dagger, the slash of pens, the groan of seats, the shudder in Keanu's grip as he clutched the microphone, his fingers trembling like a man clinging to the edge of a cliff. The textures of the moment screamed their own tale, the icy podium searing his palms, the bitter tang of adrenaline choking the air, the weight of 1,000 eyes clawing at his soul. Then, a seismic rupture, a glance to his aides, caught by the sharpest predators. A security officer surged forward, his shadow a guillotine slicing through the chaos. The air froze, glances ricocheting like gunfire, the room teetering on the brink of anarchy. This was no dialogue, it was a death knell tolling for all to hear. Jordan's eyes widened, her defiance crumbling into a gasp of disbelief as the officer loomed closer. "I'm not here to burn it down," she cried, her voice steady despite the noose tightening around her. "I'm here for the goddamn truth the people deserve to know if you'll fight or fold." Her words were a dying star, blazing with despair and fury, a plea for a savior in a world of ghosts. Keanu's breath hitched, his gaze shattering with a grief too vast to contain. "My fight's for every last one of us," he whispered, his voice a thread snapping under the strain, tears welling in his eyes as he fought to hold them back. "This isn't silence, it's survival." His words broke, a sob swallowed whole, revealing a man on the verge of disintegration. The tension detonated, a blast wave rocking the room to its core. Reporters lunged forward, pens ravenous for every crack in his armor, every tear he refused to let fall. Then came the unthinkable. The officer seized Jordan's arm, a brutal yank that tore a scream from her throat, a sound so primal it froze the blood in every vein. The room erupted, gasps, shouts, a chair crashing to the floor as chaos swallowed order whole. Her eyes locked on Keanu's, wide with betrayal, her voice a ragged howl, "So this is your truth, silence me to save your skin." The accusation was a death blow, her body dragged toward the exit as the crowd roared, a beast unleashed, fists pounding tables, voices rising in a crescendo of outrage. Keanu staggered, a hand slamming the podium as his calm shattered into jagged shards. "Stop!" he bellowed, his voice a primal roar that shook the walls, a sound torn from the depths of his soul. The officer froze, Jordan wrenching free, her chest heaving with sobs she could no longer cage, her face a mask of anguish and fury. The room fell into a stunned, trembling hush, every eye pinned on him, broken, raw, a man stripped to his bones. Tears streaked his face, his voice a wound bleeding out. "I never wanted this, I'm not your enemy, I'm one of you, fighting through the same damn dark." His confession was a gutted cry, a plea for absolution from a soul flayed alive, his body shaking as he sank against the podium, a man undone by his own heart. The silence that followed was a graveyard, littered with the wreckage of shattered ideals. What had been a press conference was now a slaughterhouse of trust, every breath a dirge for what was lost. Keanu slumped, his aides rushing forward as the room spun a kaleidoscope of shock, rage, and sorrow. Jordan stood trembling, tears carving rivers down her face, her notepad forgotten on the floor, her hands clenched into fists as if to hold herself together. The camera's word, ravenous for the carnage, as the city beyond droned on, deaf to the ruin within. Every detail seared into the senses, the splintered podium under his fists, the salt of tears staining the air, the weight of a nation's fractured faith pressing down like a shroud. Later, in the wreckage of his office, Keanu collapsed by a window, the city's dusk a cruel mirror to his despair, the sky bleeding into hues of fire and shadow. His aides hovered, shell-shocked, as Dylan's voice cut through the haze, "It's a war out there, sir. They're calling it a massacre, some say you're a tyrant, others a martyr bleeding out. It's tearing us to pieces." Keanu's laugh was a broken thing, bitter and hollow, a sound that echoed with the weight of a man who'd lost everything. "Then let them see the mess," he croaked, his voice a whisper of ash. "Release it all, every scream, every tear, every damn crack. Let them feel it." The order was a suicide pact, a surrender to the abyss, his hands trembling as he pressed them to his face, trying to hold the pieces of himself together. The footage hit like a bomb, unedited, brutal, a man unraveling under the weight of his own soul, titled The Day Keanu Reeves Broke. The world ignited, a firestorm of chaos and awe. Social media became a battlefield, hashtags like shrapnel, voices clashing in a bloodbath of blame and reverence. Some wept for him, a fallen saint crucified by his own truth, their posts a flood of heartbroken emojis and prayers. Others cursed him, a coward cloaked in crocodile tears, their words venom dripping through every thread. But beneath the chaos, his agony burned, a man who'd bared his soul and paid in blood, his every sob a testament to a fight he couldn't win. Days bled into a frenzy, talk shows clawing at his corpse, panels debating his ruin, the airwaves thick with the sound of a nation tearing itself apart. On one broadcast, a journalist demanded, her voice sharp with accusation, "Was this your stand, or your surrender?" Keanu, hollow-eyed and unshaven, stared into the camera, his voice a ghost haunting the void. "It was me, raw, real, broken. I didn't break for them, I broke for us, for every soul screaming in the dark." His words were a whisper of ash, a plea to a nation too blind to see the man behind the myth. The screen lingered on his face, etched with exhaustion and grief, a portrait of a man who'd given everything and found nothing left to hold. In the quiet, with Sam Carter, an old friend and retired scribe whose eyes had seen too many wars, Keanu unraveled completely. "I thought I could carry it," he sobbed, his hands shaking as tears soaked his sleeves. "But it's too heavy, truth's a blade, and I'm bleeding out, Sam. I'm bleeding out." His voice cracked, a sound so raw it tore at the air, his body folding into itself as if to shield what little remained. Sam's grip tightened, his own eyes brimming with tears, his voice steadied despite the tremor. "You didn't fall, Keanu, you flew, wings and all, into the fire. That's more than most dare, more than most could survive." The words were a lifeline, a faint thread in the dark, but they couldn't mend the wound, couldn't erase the blood staining his hands. As dusk bled into night, Keanu faced his team, his voice a whisper of ash and iron. "We're not done. This pain, it's fuel, it's fire. Let's rise from it, together, or die trying." It was a vow forged in tears, a flicker of defiance in a man hollowed out by his own fight. The room held his words, a shared oath to turn agony into action, their faces etched with the same grief, the same fragile hope. He stumbled to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, the city's lights blurring through his tears, a world that kept turning while he burned. Then came the twist, a shadow slicing through the wreckage like a blade through flesh. That night, as the world raged, a figure slipped into his office, a ghost cloaked in silence, unseen by aides lost in their own despair. Jordan Blake stood before him, her face a ruin of grief and resolve, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled letter, its edges worn as if she'd held it through every sleepless night. "I didn't want this," she whispered, her voice a thread of regret breaking under its own weight. "I pushed because I believed in you, because I'm dying, Keanu, and I needed to know you'd fight when I'm gone." The confession struck like lightning, a bolt that split the world in two. Her fury, her tears, her relentless war, a terminal plea masked as rebellion. Keanu froze, the air sucked from his lungs as the letter slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor to reveal a diagnosis scrawled in cold ink: terminal cancer, weeks left, a life slipping through her grasp. The room spun, his sob a choked scream as he stumbled forward, pulling her into his arms, two broken souls clinging in the wreckage of their war. "I'll fight," he vowed, his voice a shattered promise, tears soaking her hair as she trembled against him. "For you, for all of us, I'll fight till my last breath." His words were a guttural cry, a pact sealed in blood and grief, their embrace a fragile sanctuary amid the chaos. But the twist deepened, a final, cruel unraveling. As they held each other, a faint sound broke the silence, a soft click, a whirring hum from the shadows. A hidden camera, planted by an unseen hand, had captured it all, their collapse, her confession, his vow, a private wound now a public spectacle. The footage leaked before dawn, titled The Secret Fall of Keanu Reeves, spreading like wildfire through a world already ablaze. The nation watched, stunned, as their clash morphed into a tragedy too vast to fathom, a dying woman's plea, a broken man's promise, exposed and exploited for a ravenous crowd. Some wept anew, seeing the humanity beneath the myth. Others raged, calling it a staged ploy, a final manipulation. Keanu and Jordan, still locked in their fragile embrace, remained oblivious as the world devoured their pain, the camera's cold eye a silent betrayer. The screen faded on that unspoken pact, a secret torn open, a twist that turned martyr into mourner, hero into pawn, leaving the world to wrestle with a truth too raw, too human, too broken to ever fully heal. As the night swallowed Centerville whole, the city's lights flickered like dying embers against the vast, unyielding dark, a silent witness to the wreckage left behind. Keanu and Jordan stood entwined in that fragile office, their breaths ragged, their tears mingling in a quiet pact forged from the ashes of their war, a vow to fight, to endure, even as the world spun on, oblivious or ravenous beyond the glass. The hidden camera's betrayal lingered in the shadows, its cold lens a thief that had stolen their rawest truth and flung it into the chaos of a nation too fractured to hold it gently. The footage burned through the ether, a wildfire of grief and rage, twisting their private collapse into a public crucible. Some saw a dying woman's plea in a broken man's redemption, others a scripted farce, a final curtain call for a hero turned pawn. Yet in that room, stripped of pretense, two souls clung to each other, not as icons or adversaries, but as humans battered by the same relentless storm, their embrace a fragile thread of light in a tapestry of despair. The screen faded on that unspoken promise, leaving behind a silence that roared louder than any shout, a silence heavy with the weight of what had been lost and what might still be salvaged. Jordan's trembling hands, clutching a letter that spelled her end, and Keanu's shattered voice, vowing to carry her fight, painted a portrait of courage born not from triumph but from ruin. This was no tale of victory, it was a hymn to the broken, a testament to the strength it takes to stand when the ground crumbles beneath you, to speak when the world demands your silence, to love when all you have left is pain. The lesson carved itself into the air, etched in every tear, every scream, that truth is a blade we wield at our own peril, a fire that warms only when we dare to burn alongside it, and that in our deepest wounds lies the power to heal not just ourselves, but each other. From the ashes of that day, a call echoes to you, wherever you sit tonight, staring into the glow of this story, feeling the ache of their struggle in your own chest. Life will break you, too, it will drag you to the edge and demand you choose, hide or fight, fall or rise. Keanu and Jordan chose the jagged path, not for glory, but for the faint hope of something real, something worth the blood they shed. Let their scars be your mirror, their defiance your spark. If their story stirs you, if it lights a fire in your soul to chase your own truth, to stand taller through your own storms, then join us at Motivation for Success. Hit that subscribe button, become part of a community that thrives on tales of grit and grace, where every video is a beacon for the battles we all face. We'll meet you again in the next one, with stories even bolder, even truer, to fuel your journey through the dark. Until then, hold tight to this, in every fracture, there's a flame waiting to ignite. See you soon.